Hi, my name's David Bradley. This is the Schizophrenic channel and the From the Mind of a Mystic podcast. And today we're going to part 3 of Enlightenment After the Abyss, where I'll be discussing, loosely speaking, that consciousness is prime and further elaborating on my theories about the nature of the universe. Let's dive right on in. So, first of all, I've got to thank just an unbelievable number of people that have been watching my first video in the series, and another 600-700 that watched the second. I was not expecting this response. This channel is basically a notepad for my crazy nonsense in some ways, and it's also like, it's taken on multiple forms. So I had my previous channel, which was also called Schizophrenic, which was podcasts and interviews, and more like what we're doing here, and that's linked. You can find that on the shared profiles at the bottom if you go to the main page of this channel. But yeah, I just unbelievable response, and I intend to put out as much more content as I can muster, really. And just to thank you all for watching, liking, subscribing. Please continue to do that if you find it of interest, because it helps motivate me to be more articulate, more considerate, more thinking, more able to. It gives me justification to express my beliefs online, and based on what some of you lovely people have been saying, it's evidently useful, thought-provoking, and interesting. So I've been entirely flattered by all and just like challenged a lot as well. So there will be another podcast coming up soon where I reply to everything that I can manage in like a Q&A thing. So if you're watching this video and you have specific questions you want me to answer in the Q&A video and address that in a separate video, please put them in the comments now or as the video progresses, and let me know what it is you might want my opinion on, because another point probably worth mentioning is I've written down here something very specific. Please remember that I am little more than a person online trying to make sense of his own experiences and hopefully help others at the same time to possibly transcend their isolation, stigma, and challenges of life. Don't mistake me for being a scientist, a doctor, or even a philosopher. Please don't even mistake me for claiming to be as such. Right now, From the Mind of a Mystic podcast, the closest thing I can ascribe myself to, which is perhaps even then being slightly too generous, is a mystical or spiritual or mental health vlogger at best. So I wanted to preface with saying thank you and for your continued support, and I appreciate any continued support in the future. So I'm going to dive into a further treatise about amnesia, imagination, and consciousness being prime. So I'll see you in the main body of the video. So here we are, and right, so to dive right in, one of the things probably most prudent and I'd like to discuss the most in this episode of the podcast series of From the Mind of a Mystic, Enlightenment After the Abyss, is kind of the buffering of consciousness, or living in basically, I've said in previous episodes that memory defines identity, defines our relationship to reality, that memory is the defining qualia of our identity, and that without that we cease to have an identity in the same sense of lowercase self in Hinduism, or in the sense of the beyond the ego, or the transcendence of the fundamental presuppositions about the nature of consciousness and reality in relationship to our own identity in a cosmic scale. I don't know if that made any sense, but I was chatting with a good friend of mine last night at the pub, which was amazing. I'm not going to name drop or mention him at all, but he's someone who I like to debate with a lot. And so one of the things that we reached some sort of interesting consensus on, which I was going to cover in this topic, came up when I was trying to explain to him the previous video, radical subjectivity. And so I've got a little thing here to sort of prompt me to remember what I was saying. We are living in a constant state of imagination and amnesia. What we don't know we have experienced is more vast and potentially infinite in content, or at least unfathomably large by comparison to that which we know in the ordinary waking state of consciousness. And so, as I alluded to in the comments quite a few times, what we've forgotten we've experienced is unfathomably greater than that which we imagine or remember in the ordinary waking state of consciousness. Even our identity is an imagined, half-remembered fantasy that we decide and identify within the moment, and that is as illusory as samsara itself. So what am I trying to say? I talked about this in previous videos. Our notion of self is governed by imagination and memory, or not just imagination and memory, but the memories we decide to identify with in the moment are as illusory as anything else, because to consciously choose our thoughts, we'd have to think the thoughts before we think them, and therefore we'd have to generate our own thoughts consciously, which is through self-inquiry and self-observation, is very clear doesn't take place. So you can think a thought so where do thoughts appear in the mind? Similar principle to how I would describing like the universe is, the entire objective world is pre-dependent on the supposition that our own consciousness is having a valid, real experience, therefore questioning the assumption that the objective world is as objective as it might be, or even that our own subjective perspective might be incorrect, therefore the universe itself can't be said to be of any objective value or any objectivity either. So if you don't trust the fact that, I'm losing track of my thoughts a little bit, but if you assume that your subjective experience is inherently false or flawed, how can you trust that anything objective exists at all either? Like, so either way you look at that equation, we're either nothing and everything or everything and nothing. But our only reliable source of information about anything ever is our own subjective experience. So I'm going to get some clarity back and then come back. So to clarify, sorry, I had a message I got. Right. Our identity is an imagined, half-remembered fantasy that we decide and identify with in the moment. It's quite a bold statement. It's almost an offensive generalization, but I'm going to sort of try and back it up now. We're talking about the transience of thoughts and the default mode network, which I believe exists about there in the brain. I can't remember exactly, but there is actually a neural structure affiliated with the default mode network in the brain, as measured in objective reality, that can be escaped and messed with and disrupted, and the consequence of that is usually bliss or a trip or some sort of transcendent sense. So even in the objective world, we see that there is evidence in the objective world for the default mode network in the brain. However, everything we can assert about who we are is based in a memory that can also be disrupted. And as mentioned in the last video about this unbelievable, quite honestly ridiculous LSD dose, when the default mode network in that way is disrupted, or when the sense of identity based on memory and time is disrupted, there is something beneath that exists in consciousness. That is what we are, and that I would argue there's probably, if someone asked me if I've ever done bufo, which I believe is 5-MeO, toad venom, and people that have done 5-MeO report an even deeper sense of literally being annihilated from the universe and being, I believe, not even like pure consciousness, like as such, but being the total annihilation of any identity whatsoever, and that there is still consciousness in that state in some form. Now, if you've done 5-MeO, hit me up in the comments because I want to know more about that. Because as I replied, when the person asked me about I've done bufo, my drug taking career ended before I ever got a chance to do that, and it was always on the hit list. Like, do you know what I mean? It was always on the list of things I wanted to do. Ayahuasca definitely not, because of the whole, I'm diagnosed with schizophrenia, and if nothing else, people won't give me that. They have a legal and professional obligation, unless they're really sketchy, to not give a schizophrenic person at least in like the Brazilian churches and various places like that, it also contradicts with the medication and stuff like that. So I could go have a seizure and a fit, and I'll end up in a coma just from imbuing something like that. Never mind the complexification of my own psyche and potential psychotic symptoms or whatever. But what was I saying? Bufo was on the list. So if you've done Bufo, you've done 5-MeO, hit me up in the comments, because I would love to know more about the exact state that you go to, because what I'm working on is based on anecdotal evidence from people that I've watched discuss it. So any update to that systematic thinking would be useful. So where we came to concordance, back to what I was saying before, my friend is let's say a skeptic, a significant skeptic of a lot of my ideas, and that's why it's so wonderful to debate him, because he doesn't just blindly agree with what I'm saying, and I have to make a case for something for it to be accepted and argue it in a debate style fashion. I did try to get him on the podcast, but he's not interested, which is a shame, because I've done other talks with him before. But a little plug: there will be at least 3 episodes of a podcast with other people. This is monological, but there will be other dialogues in the future that I booked in, one of which I'm recording tomorrow, which I'm very excited about, but I'll say no more on that until there's something more to say on it. But a little plug: like, subscribe, share. Look out for the podcast, because we've got someone coming on to discuss, loosely speaking, things within objective reality, like what data and evidence can be found borderline scientifically and philosophically through observation within the objective world that might argue for my perceptions of consciousness and my philosophical, psycho-spiritual, religious understanding. So like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, blah 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 blah. I've got to do that, because I want this channel to have reach, so I have to upsell. I don't like doing it, but there we are. Coming back to it, one of the things I reached concordance with my skeptical friend was this concept that what we don't know that we've experienced is be far vaster than that which we remember. The idea that even your core identity. So someone asked in the comments, like, I believe, I'll paraphrase, but they asked if pure consciousness is an animation. I'm paraphrasing massively, putting it into my own words, but they were basically saying, like, our own individual identities are still individual, and that then the animating force of pure consciousness is something distinct from that or beneath that, and then what are the bounds of that, was loosely the question. I can't remember off the top of my head. Everything we're experiencing is sort of informed by, it's my experience, and it seems to be near and universal, that everything we've experienced is an echo of the last time we experienced it. So we've seen that. I've heard somewhere that every time you remember an event, it isn't the memory of the event, it's the last updated version of the last time you remembered it. So even the memories you're having that define your identity, because then I'll come back to why that is the case, everything we experience is either an imagining or remembering, which are constantly updated in like a buffered they're overwritten and rewritten and updated for the latest updated version of the program until and by necessity of that overwriting process in the brain, the memories are distorted or warped or changed or updated or corroded, basically corrupted by time. So unless you have actual data like recordings, video, audio, whatever, scientific measurements, human memory is basically inherently flawed. That's why people don't even allow first-hand evidence in a lot of cases in court, even in objective reality. First-hand evidence or first-hand testimony is often unreliable, especially in comparison to actual recorded data, materially recorded data. And that our memory is what we choose to identify with in our memory of that's me and that's what I think and these are the way I would think, and then you can get thought disorders where you might have like intrusive thoughts that seem to be alien to you because you don't identify with them, and regardless of the alienness or otherness of those thoughts, for example, people that think dialogically, like most people, as far as I know, that think in words, it's conversational, it's dialogical, it's not monological. When you first start meditating and you like, you might do mindfulness meditation, for example, and you observe your thoughts happening, and you realize that something in your head is spamming the goddamn chat at you. They're spamming the chat at you relentlessly with, I think this is happening, this is what I think, this is going on. And it's like the most tedious, mind-numbingly repetitive onslaught of pre-programmed repetitive thoughts. That's quite commonly described when you first start observing your own thoughts. But then if you do that to thinking, we have internal debates. If you think in language, you tend to think dialogically. So you might go, well, I think that X thing is the correct way to do something. Immediately there's a response from the devil's advocate of that thing that will say, well, actually, it might have this quality. And then thinking becomes dialogical, angel, demon, angel, demon. That's why people say we have an angel and a demon on each shoulder. Whether they're objectively angels, demons, peripheral to this point. But we think dialogically, and then we, from a central point of identity, then decide which of those arguments we agree with, and that thinking to go taking place. I'm a highly verbal thinker, that's why I'm so quite verbally articulate. I like to think by talking, and I think in conversation in my head, which you would imagine as a schizophrenic is a whole kettle of fish, because there's not just two of us in there, there's multifaceted, multi-dimensional, quasi super conscious like entities that I'm dealing with, as well as trying to think. Like, but the loose point is that the core witness that might, I imagine it back here, or like a much expanded point, and also deep internally, the observation you're having of your own thoughts exists beneath identification with thoughts, and that's closer to pure consciousness in my experience, and I can validate that any further. If you've got any questions, ask them. But yeah, like through self-inquiry, I said in the previous episode, like I wasn't found wanting when I did this self-inquiry. A lot of people try to look to find the observer and don't find it. I believe I have, which is why I'm more like not a Buddhist, basically, because I don't find there is no self. I find there is a self. I find there is a witness that, that this is where this whole like consciousness being prime argument comes from, is that there is something that it is like to be in my observational state of consciousness. There is a witness. There is a thing that knows, which is untouched by all of reality and all of experience. That, I mean, even saying knows, something that is experiencing all the data generated by my consciousness, all the way from the external universe right the way down to the thoughts I'm thinking, right the way down to the feelings I'm having, right the way down to the impulses I have, the intuitions, all of it, that is being observed by us as something, and that there is something that it is like to be that something. And then every other phenomena that exists in the universe is pre-dependent on that observation to my consciousness. So I've made the argument for the radical subjectivity. Now I'm trying to sort of explain within the bounds of reality, or within the bounds of self-observation, my conclusions about the nature of consciousness. It's like, how do you know what your favourite food is? Because memory informs you. How do you know what may happen to you in the future? Because you're imagining it. How do you know what happened in the past? Because probably the last time you remembered it, you wrote a program that initiated that memory, and now when you think of the thing that happened in the past, a copy of that is sent to the conscious mind to relive temporarily, and it's usually very vague. It's usually very unclear unless you're in an extreme state of consciousness or hypnotized or something like that. In the hypnagogic state in between sleeping and dreaming. Like, I think I'm just going to pause for thought, but the hypnagogic state is probably one of the most useful states of consciousness for remembering things that you didn't know you knew, because it's a state of like semi-hypnosis, absorptive, in between waking and sleeping, and I'll argue that more in a minute. Right, the hypnagogic state. So, one of the key points I'm trying to make in this video is that what we don't know could fill a library, an infinite cosmic library, and I would argue that one of the most profound things about all the states of consciousness, or even my psychotic state, or like being in any state of heightened, elevated agitation, conscious awareness, expanded state of consciousness, is that you remember things that you didn't know you knew. And I don't know if that's universal. Maybe it could be me, maybe it could be universal. I certainly find that with dreams that's the case. If you take someone just on the edge, or they're just laying down to sleep, their body's starting to relax, they're on the verge of that physical paralysis that occurs before sleep. If you talk to that person, or just prior to that, if you talk to that person about other dreams they've had, on the edge of the dream state, you remember just vastly more dreams, vastly more states of consciousness, vastly more experiences that you've ever had. And actually one of the most useful ways to get someone to fall asleep is to ask them when they're tired about what dreams they remember. And at first they're like, oh, I don't know, I don't remember any dreams. And then are you sure? And then they'll just pick out one, and then you'll find that it cascades, and they remember dream after dream after dream after dream after dream after dream, and it just becomes apparent that there is amnesia between those states, but those memories still exist, and that you can apply that to psychedelic states, or altered states of consciousness, or meditative states, or trips. And like, a good friend of mine who I won't name drop commented on my Devils and Deities video to me privately that what most blew him away about all those stories about me on psychedelics and trips and altered states of consciousnness was how much of it I remember. And I would argue that's because I'm constantly on the edge of hypnagogia. I'm constantly, as a matter of course of my condition, and just my spiritual practice, like I've consciously taken the time to learn to take my ego down into, in whatever sort of way possible, down into as many states as possible, and then do these exercises to reconnect across these multi-dimensional, multi-conscious states of being as much as possible, into something that can be brought into this waking state of consciousness and remembered. So memory is the key. Like putting yourself in, you might have this with cannabis, for example. I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and it seems to be a common theme, is where the short-term memory drops off when you use cannabis. You suddenly are able to sort of jump through time almost. You're able to access things that you've just completely forgotten that you knew, but you don't remember what just happened just now. Like where the short-term memory drops off, the long-term memory steps in as a primary function. And yeah, you can damage your long-term memory with cannabis, as we know. I hear it affects your short-term memory, as I said in other videos before. But inducing a state of relaxation, hypnagogia, you're able to suddenly realize that, or basically dream while you're awake, or become in a state of consciousness that allows you to access more of your memories. And then if you can apply the state of remembrance across vastly larger states of consciousness, you start to realize that by course of analysis of that we're living, as I said at the start of the video, in a state of constant imagination and amnesia. What we've forgotten about our experience is borderline infinite in comparison to what we think we know of who we are, and that our consciousness in the normal everyday waking state of consciousness in that kind of way of thinking is so unbelievably limited that any distortion or disturbance in that default mode network allows us to access basically a massive sphere of data that can be expanded on bit by bit through meditative practice and actively trying to remember through altered states. It's almost like state dependent memory. And then you can start to pin back together not only things that have happened in the waking world, this reality, this supposedly objective reality, but you start to remember alternate realities, and you become what they call an aeronaut, a lucid dreamer. But I'm implying you can, like a dream weaver. Yeah, I'm looking through my notes here, just trying to think exactly what I'm trying to say. I think I said this in the last video, but we are dream weaving gods that exist in a state of perpetual amnesia. And the second we remember, our entire perspective of reality is fundamentally altered until we forget again and again and again. So, psychonaut and aeronaut is another word I'm looking for. But anyway, it's basically you start to be able to travel through your own consciousness and realise that, if all that we are is a result of what we thought, but we don't know what we've thought, we don't remember who we are, and that there is, even in the dream state, there's potentially an unfathomable amount of experiences that our consciousness has had. If you wake someone up from a dream in the REM state and you say, what were you experiencing? They can describe a phenomenologically distinct reality that they were experiencing that then fades. So applying that theory of mind to all of existence, basically, that's sort of the point now. I think I'm going to probably stop there, but just recognizing basically, we're in a position where we've forgotten more than we know, and that what we know is so limited that to have any assumption that we know anything is simply an assumption and nothing else. So get me in the comments with your thoughts on this. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share the video, and then I find it useful. There will be a fourth video, but I'm really mulling that one over because I don't know exactly what I want to do. But it may be a reply. I may jump to the reply video if I can't think of anything more coherent to add on this exact subject. But most likely the next video will be me addressing all the comments, feedback, thoughts, ideas that I can stomach to actually get through, because this is nearly 1,000. I don't even know. Let me just double check. There's just an unfathomably large amount of comments that I would have to address. So I'm going to go through and rank them in terms of their popularity, what people what people have reacted to most. But we've got somewhere in the region of 500 comments to get through to address. So I'm not going to do them all, but that most likely be in the next video. And then from there I'll be moving on to the interviews and podcast series, and then I'll come back with more monological stuff as and when I think of something pertinent to say. Thank you for watching. I've been David Bradley. This is the Schizophrenic channel from the Mind of Mystic. Catch you in the comment section. Peace.